Okay, good evening. Welcome everyone to our Shabbat morning Bible study that's been exiled to Thursday nights here during the COVID-19. And it is October 1st, 2020. And we are going to be starting Sukkot tomorrow evening, Friday night, in Jerusalem in a very, probably the most original Sukkot we've ever had. In probably millennia. And tonight we're going to talk about Sukkot from the Bible and some of the things connected to it. So let's open in prayer. Lord, we thank you for being with us now as we study your word. Thank you for your Holy Spirit. Thank you for being with us no matter where we are in life, no matter our struggles, and no matter if we're all by ourselves. Your word says that you're there with us, and you number our tears. You know the number of hairs on our head, and you are intimate, and you know us because you created us. Help us to know you more and to be aware of you. In your name we pray, Jesus. Amen. So, without further ado, let's open up our Bibles to Exodus 23. And the first thing I want to do as we talk about Sukkot, or the Feast of Tabernacles, today, is I want to give it some context for where it fits in the whole scheme of the biblical calendar. And if you go to Exodus 23, and we're going to read from 14 to 17, it says, 3 times a year, you are to celebrate a festival to me. Celebrate the festival of unleavened bread. For 7 days, eat bread made without yeast, as I commanded you. Do this at the appointed time in the month of Aviv. For in that month you came out of Egypt. No one is to appear before me empty-handed. Celebrate the festival of harvest with the first fruits of the crops you sow in your field. Celebrate the festival of ingathering at the end of the year, when you gather in your crops from the field. 3 times a year, all the men are to appear before the sovereign Lord. And you also see a parallel scripture in Exodus 34, verses 22 to 24, where it talks about 3 times a year. And these are known as the Shalosh Regalim, which essentially are pilgrim festivals that in Deuteronomy, it talks about when you celebrate or you commemorate these festivals, you're to go to the place where I will show you, or the place that I will choose. And that place has always been understood as Jerusalem, or the temple, and later on in Israel's history. And so these were 3 times a year that the people, if they were able, they were to go up to Jerusalem, to the temple, and to celebrate these 3 festivals. And just to clarify which ones they are, the Feast of Unleavened Bread is connected to, what do we call it normally?
Pesach, Passover.
Yeah, Pesach, for Passover. Then the Festival of Harvest, Shavuot, which we also call Weeks, right? Festival of Weeks. And then the last one is ours, which we call Sukkot. But here in Exodus 23, 7-16, it's called the Festival of Ingathering. And notice on the calendar, these 3 flow together. They're the Passover or unleavened bread happens in the spring. And then about 50 days later, you have Shavuot, or the weeks. And then at the end of summer, before the rainy season starts, you have this ingathering and or the Sukkot, the Tabernacles. And here we have Beth joining us. And notice also that these three festivals are connected also to agriculture. In Pesach, Passover, it's the feast. Sorry, it's the harvest of the barley, and then in Shavuot you have the harvest of the wheat, and then now in Sukkot we're having the harvest of like grapes and olives, figs, and what's the other thing? The tamarim.
Pomegranates, rimonim.
Yeah, the pomegranates and tamarim, the dates, among other things. And so that's one way to look at it. You have this agricultural background to it. The other way to look at it, though, is through the eyes of Israel and the story of the nation. And it's an annual cycle, and it reminds the people of their relationship with God, how it started and how it got to where it is currently with them. First off, Passover commemorates, we just read there in Exodus 23:15. Why does he say keep the 7 days of eating bread without yeast, matzah? Because that's when he brought them out of Egypt,
Yeah.
right? Okay, what about Shavuot? It doesn't say here in Exodus 23, but when does Shavuot in Jewish tradition, what's it usually connected to in the story of Israel?
Giving of the Torah.
Right, the giving of the Torah, which is at Sinai, right? And if you look at Exodus 19, when it talks about when the people come up to Sinai to get ready for Moses to go up and to receive the Luchot Habrit and the Ten Commandments, that it says it's in the, what is it, the third month? And so this is connected to the current, the calendar, the Jewish calendar that we have. And so it's tied together with that the festival of weeks is happening at the time of the Torah being given to Israel. And this is when Israel comes into, they were brought out of Egypt, but now when they're at Sinai and they're given the law, the Torah, this is a very monumental moment because they're receiving the law, they're receiving this covenant that is setting them apart among all the nations. And it's a special, you'd almost call it the birth of Israel, because Israel is being born with their identity. This is where their identity is found now at Sinai. And then we come to Sukkot. And this is the interesting thing to consider. What is Sukkot? What's the point of Sukkot in the story of Israel?
Sukkot is the remembering of coming through the desert into the land of Canaan. So it's looking back and remembering and telling it to your children.
Right. So if you were to look at Leviticus 23 and verse 42, Leviticus 23, verse 42, they're commanded, live in temporary shelters, Sukkot, for 7 days. All native-born Israelites are to live in such shelters, Sukkot. So your descendants will know that I had the Israelites live in these Sukkot when I brought them out of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. And so this is commemorating the people, let's say they were in the womb in Egypt. They go to Sinai. Labor happens. They're born, and the wilderness becomes their, what I'd like to call their playground as children, as teenagers, even, where it's a long teenage years of 40 years, right? But it's where they're wandering around and kind of learning from their mistakes. Um, and Sukkot, you know, funnily, how am I going to say this? Amusingly, remembers the teenage years of Israel, the challenges, the struggles, all these stories that we read in Numbers and Exodus and Deuteronomy that are not so nice stories, the pimples, the puberty, and
Also, the rebellion and the complaining.
isn't that what a teenager is?
Yeah.
And so um, it's interesting that, this is the trilogy of the festivals, but I've always found it fascinating that there's not a fourth festival for probably the most, at least in our mind today, if we celebrate, Independence Day, or we celebrate all of these national holidays in countries, in the Bible, Israel doesn't have kind of like their Independence Day, or the day that they enter Canaan, right? Crossing the Jordan River into the Holy Land, as it's become known in tradition. But the Promised Land, there's no festival for this in the whole story of Israel.
Could that be because the whole becoming a nation and covering all the land which was promised took a lot of years, so you can't speak of one day in which they became independent?
I don't know. I find it interesting because, this seems to be a theme in the Bible. The Bible doesn't want the people to focus on a king, right? Or God doesn't want the people to focus on a king. You're not supposed to worship other gods. You're not supposed to put your faith in a place. Even Moses, probably you could argue is the greatest leader in Jewish history, is not allowed to enter this land. And so it's very interesting that this grand entrance is not commemorated in Israel's story. And we'll come to that in a second, not in a second, but towards the end here. I don't want to belabor it too far. But I do want to kind of focus on Sukkot, that out of these feasts, one could argue that it's the most important of the feast. That in Numbers 29, there's these elaborate rites that you have to sacrifice all of these animals, tons and tons of animals. This is when Solomon dedicates the temple, is at Sukkot in 1 Kings 8. The story of Hanukkah with the Maccabees, that's how Hanukkah is how many days?
8.
It's 8 days, and it's connected. It's actually built on Sukkot's days, which is the 7 plus the extra day. And in Deuteronomy 31, it's on Sukkot when the Torah is read publicly every 7 years. You'll remember when there's the civil war and the northern tribes break away from Judah and Jerusalem, that Jeroboam, the first king of the north, he builds these high places in the north, and he tries to make a competing festival to Sukkot. That's what he focuses on to gain the people's loyalty. You can find that in 1 Kings 12. And for a lot of us here now, this is the only festival that the nations are commanded to keep. So there's something about Sukkot that is highlighted, There's a special focus in the Bible. So another thing about Sukkot, if you go to Deuteronomy 16, start in verse 13, it says, celebrate Sukkot, Festival of Tabernacles, for 7 days. After you have gathered the produce of your threshing floor and your winepress. Oh, sorry, I forgot to mention grapes. Grapes is a big thing that's harvested now. And then verse 14, be joyful at your festival, you, your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, and the Levites, the foreigners, the fatherless, and the widows who live in your towns. Be joyful. Just repeating that idea. And then go down, verse 15. For 7 days celebrate the festival to the Lord your God at the place the Lord will choose. For the Lord your God will bless you in all your harvest and in all the work of your hands, and your joy will be complete. So notice here twice joy is mentioned, simcha, in the Hebrew. And you
Just
know
a
what?
question.
Yeah.
Verse 15, the place which God chooses. Does that mean it is a festival you have to celebrate only in Israel?
Well, it's, I mean,
Does it
today,
implicate it?
no, right. Today, no. Today, no, but it's one of these things in the Bible. They did want you to come to Jerusalem to celebrate. Yeah. So, back to the whole joy aspect, the simcha. What comes at the end of Sukkot?
Simchat Torah.
In the Shmini Atzeret and Simchat
Yeah,
Torah.
Shmini Atzeret in the Bible, and then later in Jewish tradition, you have this Simchat Torah, and that's, what is that connected to, or what's the purpose? Celebrating.
Joy, yes, it's joy.
Yeah, you're celebrating the Lord giving His word, right? Torah, and there's the joy that goes into all of this.
When does the new cycle actually technically start?
You mean with Genesis chapter 1?
Yeah,
It starts the week after. I mean,
the week after Simchat
Yeah.
Torah, is it?
that's right. And
No, according to this here, for this year, you've given us Genesis 1 on Simchat Torah, 10th of October.
no, on Simchat Torah, you also read Genesis 1 with Deuteronomy.
Oh, you're right.
The last,
That's, yeah.
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 And then the next week, you read the first 6 chapters
Right.
of Genesis. Yeah.
Don't forget, we need a new cycle.
It's on the website, on the Narkis website. You just
Is it?
click on the link there.
Okay, I get it.
I
Okay.
should have put it in the, I forgot to tell everybody.
Okay,
So-
I'll get it.
To rejoice as a commandment, does that have a special verb in Hebrew?
Hold on. I think
Like
How can you
Simchat-
be happy on commandments?
Simhateinu.
That's the thought behind it.
go ahead, Monica.
Simhateinu, it's like we rejoice.
Yeah.
So it's
Sorry.
an active verb.
Also another name.
Well, you get it often enough in the Psalms. The command to rejoice, the command to praise, the command to, I mean, it goes on repeating all the time, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's like, the verb is sameach and simcha is the noun, but the verb is what's being used there. The samachta.
The
You know,
greeting is Moadim l'simcha.
Sorry.
The greeting is Moadim l'simcha. Keep going with the rejoicing.
Right. Yeah, we're going to go into the simcha here in a second, the rejoicing. But I want to go back to, again, the joy. I think the joy here, we have Simchat Torah, which comes later on, but we don't see that in the Bible, as far as what I can tell. I want to make a suggestion. Where is this joy coming from here at Sukkot?
From the harvest?
Okay, yeah, that would sound very reasonable. The harvest, and
About the idea of the presence of the Lord being with them, being their shade by day and the cloud of fire by night, that his presence is there, his comfort.
yes, and I think also that is definitely where I am heading, because the presence, I believe, of the Lord is being felt in that, as you just said, the shade, right? There was that the pillar of fire and the cloud that followed them in the wilderness, which I guess you could say is like a shade. It's like a big sukkah. But they're celebrating, in a sense, they're celebrating these Sukkot, which essentially is camping. It's like, depending on how you want to interpret your Sukkah here, which we will here in a second, the people are camping. How many of you like to camp for a long time?
No.
How many people like to camp for, like, it's one thing to go for a week, and sleeping on the ground without an air mattress. But how many of us, prefer that over a bed? It's very, I mean, I guess we'd get used to it after a month or so, but it probably wouldn't be a nice getting used to. And so it's interesting. The kids, like the kids in the country here, that's one of the things they'll do is they'll go and sleep outside in the sukkah during Sukkot at night, and they'll get attacked by all the mosquitoes, and they'll come in covered in, red welts, because this is now when the mosquitoes are coming out. And, it's fun a little bit, but mosquitoes and all the other stuff can start to wear you down. And a sukkah, in its basic form, what was it originally used for?
Shelter.
Sorry?
Shelter?
Shelter, but for who? Would people actually live in these
For
things?
the animals?
Okay, maybe for animals, but maybe it's not even good enough for an animal, because usually they would put animals in caves, or they would put them inside the houses with themselves for the night.
Isn't it for when the people are gathering in the crops? They need to be by the crops, since the villages, they live close to one another, but they have a ways to go for where all their things are being grown. So they stay out there during the times of the harvest.
Exactly. It's more of a lean-to, temporary, like you just said, it's for a short time period. It wouldn't be something that you'd probably have to rebuild it every year. And you think of the story of Jonah. Remember, he's upset at God and what he didn't destroy Nineveh, so he goes outside the city, and what's he build? He builds a sukkah, and he sits there, and does it do a very good job for him? Do you remember the sun comes up and beats on his head?
The sun comes up and the east wind blows it away, doesn't it? So God gives him a what's it called? Oil plant. And
Yeah.
the plant then grows up, and then that Joel gets pissed off because the worms eat the plant and kill the plant, so he doesn't have any protection.
Right. So his sukkah isn't so great. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah.
So in its basic form, it's like we just said, it's a simple structure. It's very temporary. But what happens is when the Hebrew is being translated into Greek in the Septuagint, sukkah is translated as skene, and in the Greek. And this is also used for the word we have in Hebrew for tent, ohel. And it's also used for the Mishkan, for tabernacle. And by the way, tabernacle that we have in English comes from Latin. which has a meaning of tent or hut. And you know, the word tavern is connected to that, tabernacle, tavern. But so what I'm trying to point out here is that when we start to come into our translations, we see the meaning of these Sukkot also are like tents, and they still kind of keep their same idea. They're temporary. It's like camping. If we were to go camping today, it's still that same idea. It's something you don't stay in long. You don't live in it, let's put it that way. And it's for a short period. So it reminds you that it's temporary. This is a temporary structure.
But in the commandment, God said that's where you were in those 40 years. So that's just a little bit longer as just a short period.
So we could argue that that was one of the miracles in Sinai in the desert, or maybe it also has an idea of a tent as well at some point.
Like the Bedouins.
Yeah, maybe like the Bedouin. I haven't done an exhaustive search on it, but yeah, it would be interesting to kind of lay out how the people would have functioned for 40 years with Sukkot or tents, or if they stayed in place for years, right? Or they were moving every so often to follow water. I don't know. So
we do know, don't we, that they moved around. I remember doing a count in numbers, and there was something like 33 moves or 40 moves or something,
right.
over so many years. So surely the Feast of Sukkot, the 8 days or the 7 days or however you count it, has got a much more of almost a spiritual implication in terms of, yes, remembering that you were living from place to place in tents in Sukkot or however you happen to do it. And also this whole thing about Emmanuel, God was with you, whether you talk about it in the shade. And of course, I believe passionately that that's when Yeshua was born. He is he's the spiritual fulfillment of Sukkot, but he becomes Emmanuel. The word becomes flesh and tabernacles with us. So, but it ties up as well with the shade, the pillar of fire, the cloud, everything. It's all part of the protection. It's all part of the evidence that God was with us.
Right, the presence of God.
Right.
So, another thing that I want to go on with Sukkot here is with the three festivals, these three pilgrimage festivals, there are, in rabbinic tradition, there's three scrolls, Megillot. There's one scroll that's read for each of the festivals. There's 5 total. One is for Purim, and one is for Tisha B'Av. But for these 3, for Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot, what are the scrolls that are read for them? Who knows?
The book of Ruth, for Shavuot.
Is for Shavuot.
Shavuot.
That's right. And then Passover, it's not so commonly known, but it's Song of Songs.
Song of Songs in Ecclesiastes now, isn't it?
Yes. And so for Sukkot, it's Kohelet, Ecclesiastes. And I'm going to call Ecclesiastes essentially means like a gathering, and Kohelet, they're not sure exactly what it means, but it's related to Kahal, to like a community. And they often translate it as preacher, as someone who's this speaker. But so Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, often they've asked over time, why is this book read at Sukkot? So any ideas out there? Ecclesiastes, Kohelet, why is it read during Sukkot?
It's all about the temporary nature of life.
Yeah.
I mean,
if you were to go into that whole idea of what a sukkah is, it truly fits the theme of Kohelet, which says everything is vanity of vanities, right? It's
Vanity, vanity, all is vanity, says the preacher.
chasing after the wind. And so, Kohelet reminds us of our life cycle here on earth, our birth, our childhood, our teenage years, when we become young adults, when we get our career and we work hard. And then as we get older and we slow down, and even talks about death. And you think of like the third chapter of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes 3, where it talks about, there's a time to be born and a time to die. There's a season for everything, a time to plant, a time to uproot. A very famous chapter. And but the whole purpose of Kohelet is, if you were to read his first chapter, or actually just read his whole book this week, is he wants to understand God's wisdom. He wants to understand the wisdom of God. Kohelet is a wisdom book, just like Proverbs, just like Job, and Chokhmah, the Hebrew word for wisdom. They're trying to understand how God works. And we've talked about this before. What is, according to the Bible, what's wisdom? What's the wisdom of the Lord?
To know him.
And
The
how
fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom.
yes, Proverbs says the fear of the Lord. So to know the Lord, according to Proverbs, is to have a reverence for God. Not fear as, right, we all know, not fear as to be afraid of him, but to honor him and to respect who he is. And how do you demonstrate that respect? Throughout Proverbs and Job and wisdom literature. Well, actually, just throughout the Bible. Deuteronomy, especially, we've been reading this last month or two, is, what's the Shema say?
To love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your me'od.
And what does that mean to love him in practical terms?
Listen and obey.
Exactly.
And to love your neighbor as yourself.
Right. But all of that is based on the premise you listen, and by listening, you're obeying what God has said through his word, through his commands, through Torah. That is what it means to be righteous in the sight of the Lord. And
Gary, I've just seen something which ties up with the Ecclesiastes 3:1, which I'd never seen before, but it ties up with this whole idea of these three festivals and their appointed times. For everything there is a season.
yes,
And it's so clear when you're to celebrate Passover. We've just been out, technically, we're supposed to be celebrating the new moon tomorrow night, but it looks like a new moon tonight. We've just been out to photograph it. And it really is, and everything is fitted into the times and the seasons of God's appointed, the Moedim, the appointed times.
yeah,
Moedim l'simcha, keep going with the joy, almost according to God's appointed times.
yeah, yeah,
I'd not seen it before there.
yeah. And so here's what I want to ask everyone. Ecclesiastes is one of these kind of strange books in the Bible. Why is it strange for anybody who's actually read it?
It doesn't mention God that often.
I mean, it does talk about God, but how does it talk about God in relation to the world or humans?
It's mainly, I think, about the relation you have with your neighbor and with yourself, and with your own vulnerability. Well, things are not that important as they seem, and by contemplating, getting back to the essentials of life.
Yeah,
Okay.
but the tie-up, isn't it, is that man is miserable unless he gets himself right in connection with, his life is futile. Um, whatever it is, it's really focused on man more than it is on God.
Well, let me just read in the first chapter, verse 18. 118. I also said to myself, as for humans, God tests them so that they may see that they are like the animals. Surely the fate of human beings is like that of the animals. The same fate awaits them both. As one dies, so dies the other. All have the same breath. Humans have no advantage over animals. Everything is meaningless. All go to the same place, all come from dust, and to dust all return. Who knows if the human spirit rises upward and if the spirit of the animal goes down into the earth? So I saw that there is nothing better for a person than to enjoy their work because that is their lot. For who can bring them to see what will happen after them?
Where are you? I've lost you.
Chapter,
Ecclesiastes.
chapter 1, I read 18 to 22. So what do you think about that?
I haven't even got a 22.
Gives us our perspective.
Well, let's just say that Kohelet is, he would be, if he was in the political arena, he would not be in kind of a major party of the Bible. He's definitely a minority thinker, and I mean he's people call him a skeptic, almost like a postmodern thinker, and even though obviously that couldn't happen, but he's almost like a philosopher here, and when you read some of his musings, and so you go on and you read the whole book, and he's debating back and forth about, well, it's good to work, it's good to enjoy yourself, it's important to serve God and know the Lord and wisdom and all of this stuff, but he struggles with seeing justice in the world. That's kind of the bottom line here. He sees that a wicked person might live to be 100, and a righteous person might be killed at 20 for doing the right thing. And so it's hard for him to reconcile the justice of God. And so he's conflicted, is what I'm trying to get at. He has a heart for God, I would definitely say, but he's not vanilla. He's got a special flavor of ice cream going on here. And he recognizes that life is complicated here on earth. Okay, so all of that to say, come back to Sukkot, and we're saying that Sukkot is connected to this whole idea of our temporary nature here on earth, which, as we said, fits nicely with Kohelet, with Ecclesiastes' idea of we're breath and we quickly come and go on this earth. In our years, they're nothing in the face of eternity. And so go to Ecclesiastes 7, chapter 7, verse 1. And this is a central point in all of this from Kohelet. Chapter 7, verse 1. He says, a good name is better than fine perfume, and the day of death is better than the day of birth. It is better to go to a house of mourning than to go to a house of feasting, for death is the destiny of everyone. The living should take this to heart. Okay, so let's try to unpack this. The day of death is better than the day of birth. So what are some ways to interpret this?
That when you get to heaven, it's just going to be joy rather than being born into a world of sin and trouble. Or is that too obvious?
Wait, say it one more time. The day of death is better because why?
Because you're going to heaven, to a place of joy and peace, rather than being born into a world of sin and a world of trouble.
Okay, so you're leaving the troubles behind. Right. Okay, any other ideas?
It's like Yeah, it's like what he says in another place. The end of a thing is better as the start of a thing. It's better to finish something as to start something. When you finish your life, it's done. The job is done.
Yes. Yes. Um, I think I think that is where ultimately he's going here, because the key here is the first phrase of that verse: a good name is better than fine perfume. And so it's a couplet: a good name is better than fine perfume, and the day of death better than the day of birth. And so the way we would interpret the day of death is connected to a good name. And it's not a good name in that your name sounds good. It's a good name in that your name, what it means. When someone hears your name and you have a good reputation, they're like, oh yes, that's a good person, that's a good name. And so, like you said, Richard, when you come to your death, the job is done and your life has been lived. And if you have a good name, if you've, followed the Lord and sought his wisdom, then you've left a legacy behind that, whereas a day of your birth, the day everybody celebrates when a baby's born, it's a joyous occasion, but the baby is just starting. It's like, when you get ready to run a race, and I know they cheer people when they start races, but most of the cheering is at the very end, right? At the end of the race, because that's when you start to see how people finish the race. And so Kohelet is talking about our lives if we choose to seek the Lord, to follow him, and if we have our focus on that idea that we are living even in the midst of hard times and struggles, and let's just say we sin, we make mistakes. If you read this whole chapter of chapter 7, it basically talks about that the righteous mess up. They're not perfect, but it's not about being perfect. It's about, as Proverbs says, the righteous might fall 7 times, but they always get up. And the key is getting back up. And that's what makes the day of death better than the day of birth.
It's interesting, isn't it, Gary, that eulogies at Jewish funerals are quite different from the sort of eulogies that you get at the average, let's call it Christian funeral, whatever. A eulogy is a very long thing, and it really is extolling the good reputation, whatever the work is, whatever the nature is, whatever the legacy is. Miriam Levinger has just died. She's the woman who went into the hotel in Hebron in 1967, in effect brought back the whole of Hebron and the whole idea of Gush Etzion back into Jewish hands. And she died at the age of 83 on Yom Kippur night. And I read all her eulogies from her children and people around her, and it was amazing. And it's a very, very good thing here. This reputation at the day of her death is quite different from the fact of the rejoicing 83 years ago when this little girl was born.
Right.
And it goes on. It's almost better to go to a house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. Feasting is just a temporary thing. You go to the house of mourning and you're really valuing whoever it is who's passed on.
Yep. It's looking at this whole thing and what is temporary and what is eternal, what's got longer lasting purpose to it. And
maybe it has also to do with the mindset. The heart is right, tuned in a house of mourning.
right. I think what you would probably say here is the humility of the person. When you go to a funeral and you see someone in front of you who's passed on, it immediately brings you back to, wow, that could be me. It's the ultimate equalizer. Death is, and it brings us to that point of humility of the fear of the Lord, the I would say even God's presence. And so I
What
think all of
still
it.
lingers through, what still lingered through my mind is what Sharon shared last week about the high priest dressing down back to basics before he could enter into the Holy of Holies.
Mm.
In essence, that's exactly what we're talking about now for the whole of Israel, for all the people.
Yes. And going to Sukkot, that idea of the people are not living in houses for these 7 days, they're living in these tents. They're living in these Sukkot, these shabby little things. And these Sukkot represent our bodies. Just like this person in chapter 7, that our bodies are temporary shelters for our souls, right? And just like our bodies are temporary, we also recognize our life here on earth is temporary. And that reminds, that whole idea of humility kind of permeates throughout whatever we do. If our focus is on that idea that our provisions, our things are temporary, our riches, if we're billionaires, no matter how rich we become, we cannot take it after we die. And we have to recognize that it all comes from the Lord. And that's why we're commanded to share, right? Back in Deuteronomy 16, it says during Sukkot, invite in all the poor people, all the widows and the orphans, and make sure they celebrate with you for the 7 days. So it's a festival of hospitality to the entire society. And I
Which
think
is
that's
why
really,
this year is so difficult. I was thinking that it's interesting. Richard was talking about the priest, dressing down and the whole business of approaching the Holy of Holies, which gets reenacted here in terms of Yom Kippur, and Sharon was teaching on Yom Kippur. So you're dressing in white, you're dressing down, you're coming in an attitude of humility and of fasting. And then I think it's Isaiah that says, or I forget where it is now in the Haftarah, what is the fast that I've called? It's not the fast of simply, just not eating or whatever. The fast I've given is to give to the poor, release the brokenhearted. And then 4 days later, with this whole thing, we move straight into this understanding that we're living in temporary buildings and our bodies themselves are temporary. It's all part of this amazing continuum, which which basically starts at Pesach and comes all the way through.
yes, yeah.
And if you're right, and we don't get a sort of fourth final, Yom Ha'atzmaut, a biblical Yom Ha'atzmaut that you're talking about, it's like we start with life, we come out of Egypt, and we die.
So
There is
right, so right,
this is what it's about.
right, and so we have Kohelet, right? This
Yeah.
kind of book where he's like, things look pretty meaningless if I were to like look at life through my humanistic lens. We're like animals. There, we read back in chapter 1. But if you read it in the context of Sukkot, and you read it within that, the wilderness is this place where God meets his people. You remember the prophet Hosea? He talked about the time in the wilderness as this, it was the place where he got engaged with Israel. It's in Hosea chapter 2.
Yeah,
and it's when the people are now fornicating with these other gods in the northern kingdom. And in Hosea 2, God says, therefore, I'm going to allure her. I will lead her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her. And
I'll give her back her vineyards.
Yeah.
And from there, they'll make the valley of Echo, which I think is weeping, isn't it? A door of hope.
And that's Perach. That's Perach. No. The door of hope is Perach Tikva, by the way.
Yeah. So the valley of Echo. Is Echo isn't hope though?
No.
It just says, I'll make the valley of Achor a door of hope, a Petah Tikva, yeah. And she will respond there as in the days of her youth.
Yeah.
Yeah, amazing.
So this, again, I'm trying to emphasize that the wilderness is this very hard and difficult place. And if the wilderness is like it was for Israel as their life on earth, their years of maturing in the Lord, and again, all their struggles and all their sins, for us, if we see it through the eyes of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, it's also our time, our walk with the Lord. And we're going to kind of close with that. But I want to bring you back one more thing. We mentioned that Sukkot is this feast of joy, Simcha. We talked about earlier. And Kohelet talks a lot about joy, eating and drinking and pleasure. And he says that Simcha, this joy, is given by God to the righteous. It's part of life. If you were to look at Ecclesiastes 2, chapter 2, verse 1, it says there, Kohelet saying, I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. But that also proved to be meaningless. The pleasure there is simcha, is joy. Laughter, I said, is madness. And what does pleasure accomplish? And then go to verse 26. To the person who pleases him, God gives him wisdom, knowledge, and happiness or joy or simcha. But to the sinner, he gives the task of gathering and storing up wealth to hand it over. If you go to Ecclesiastes 5:20, it talks about here in verse 19, or actually it's starting 18, 5:18. This is what I observe to be good, that it is appropriate for a person to eat, to drink, and to find satisfaction in their toilsome labor under the sun during the few days of life God has given them, for this is their lot. Moreover, when God gives someone wealth and possessions and the ability to enjoy them, to accept their lot and be happy in their toil, this is a gift of God. They seldom reflect on the days of their life because God keeps them occupied with joy, gladness of heart here. So the same idea, that joy, simcha, is very much a part of Kohelet, of his worldview. It's a part of life. I know he comes across as kind of negative and dark and we're all going to die type of thinking, but he's actually focused on the entire life picture. And I find I'm suggesting that Sukkot and Ecclesiastes, Kohelet, are connected by this idea, this theme of joy. That joy is a crucial part of life. And can we even say having fun? And so Sukkot is this holiday it's a celebration of fun stuff with families and kids and camping and all of that, but it's also a celebration of life struggles, of the journey, of our frailties. And the reason why we celebrate those things is it reminds us that God is present when we go through those times, just like the people were when they went through it in the wilderness.
Say that Sukkot is a kind of remedy of all the hurts you had in the past year or years to be healed from by joy.
Could be, definitely. I mean, for sure, when you gather with family, friends, community, there is some healing there, for sure. I I just think you see it in any type of community situation when people become lonely and they're separated. I mean, this is why the whole COVID-19 lockdown and all of this is, it's starting to drag on a little bit now, and the virus might not kill as many people as people who are, cut off from people. So that's one of the big things that the policymakers have to kind of consider and balance when they're making these decisions.
I mean, the situation, Gary, I think this week is very, very serious. I mean, there's a huge, I don't know if people know, there's a massive rise of infections in the last 24 hours here. And it all comes out of the very Orthodox communities. And they're having very big trouble because you can't build a sukkah. I went out to try and buy just regular strings of whatever it is today, and they're not selling them. They're not allowed to sell them. You can put up your walls and you can put up your roof, and then you can't really meet in them. And in England, you've got a maximum of 6, which is ridiculous. As Beth's got a friend with 9 kids or something before they even start. But here, if we're lucky, we've got somebody with us, but some people are really alone, and it's really beginning to get to them. And it's very hard then, Moedim l'Simcha, go on with the thing. And it's you really have to know God is with you. And I think people are finding it very, very hard here in a world and in a situation where we do celebrate Sukkot and we do build a sukkah and we do understand what it is. And this is the whole country. This is not 1 or 2 odd religious ones or a few keen Christians. This is something that is part of the whole thing. The shops shut down on the holidays and so on and so on. And this week is particularly difficult because it's the whole week. Usually what happens is you get a holiday at the beginning, let's say on a Wednesday night, Thursday, and then Friday you mess around, and then you go into another holiday on Saturday, and you end up with only 3 or 4 days of actual holiday. But this week it starts tomorrow night, Friday night, and it will end next Saturday on Saturday, and that's it. Right. And so for a whole week, people are tied, and you can't drive and you can't go places and so on.
Yeah.
Gary?
Yep.
What's the idea of having this most perfect etrog to have it? They go to even take a magnifying glass to try to find this perfect fruit. You never find the perfect one, and they pay great prices for it. And where does all that come in play? The lulav and all these other things.
Well, that comes from Leviticus 23. And that's where
it talks about the 4 species, and if you're very, very observant, your 4 species have to be very, very perfect. And one of the great stresses that's going on at the moment is that what are called the Sukkot Markets, which are packed, as you said, with all these people looking for the perfect etrog, they're empty. It's really scary. But they're building huge sukkahs, and we don't really know what's going to go on. But there's a limit. You can't be together. So they're having a lot of scares.
I want to finish in 5 minutes.
Right.
And
sorry.
No. And then we can have a discussion about all the other stuff as well. But I just want to kind of tie this all together here, because the time has run out. Joy. Here's a question. I guess where does joy come from? Can you manufacture it? Can you force yourself to be joyful? I mean, think about what we've grown up with in maybe Sunday school lessons or what we've read in the Bible. Where does true joy come from? Paul talks about it, Peter, Jesus, the whole Bible. What does Jesus say when you're persecuted for righteousness' sake? It says rejoice.
Your name is written in heaven.
Right, but he says rejoice.
Yeah, because your name is written.
Yeah, rejoice. What does Paul say when you suffer for the Lord? Right?
knowing that your name is written in heaven.
No, that's Luke.
Yeah, but the same idea with Paul and Peter. When you suffer, when you
Yes.
go through hard times,
You're one with
the
the
Lord,
Lord.
and when you're one with the Lord, you have joy. It's when we're fat, when we are rich, when we are full of whatever we have and we are satisfied. I mean, the Bible talks about this over and over. We lose satisfaction, we lose joy, and we lose our connection to the Lord. And so I think this is where Sukkot is getting this idea of rejoice, be joyful. This is a celebration of the wilderness. Because you suffered in the wilderness, you can have this joy. And it becomes harder today when you have a festival that goes back 3,000 plus years and you are well off and you don't really know what it means to live in a tent or to suffer, that people start to lose focus of the real meaning of what Sukkot would be, or as Christians would say, the true meaning of Christmas or Easter or whatever. But it's that same idea. And so joy comes from being thankful for what the Lord has given, because when you lack for something, then you appreciate it more. When you
So isn't that interesting that we're in this and it's terrible and it's Sukkot and we should rejoice, and God, we need to really look at God to really rejoice. What are we being challenged at? Interesting, it's lockdown in Israel and Sukkot. Right on.
Yeah, that's my point, David. You nailed it. That's it. Because it's amazing that we're living in this time where it's starting to get a bit suffocating, and in some ways, and it's like now is the time to find that presence of the Lord, that joy in whatever situation each one of us is in.
Is that what God is doing? God, what are you doing? Is that it? Might be.
That's the question we have to ask him. So I just want to end with the very famous words of the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 5. 2 Corinthians 5 to close. I'm going to read the first 10 verses. And maybe you can just pray this as I'm reading this, and kind of meditate and contemplate it in this whole picture of Sukkot and in our own lives. What is God doing and how do I fit into his plan? 2 Corinthians 5, starting in verse 1. For we know that if the earthly tent we live in is destroyed, we have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven, not built by human hands. Meanwhile, we groan, longing to be clothed instead with our heavenly dwelling, because when we are clothed, we will not be found naked. For while we are in this tent, we groan and are burdened, because we do not wish to be unclothed, but to be clothed instead with our heavenly dwelling, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. Now the one who has fashioned us for this very purpose is God, who has given us the Spirit as a deposit, guaranteeing what is to come. Therefore, we are always confident and know that as long as we are at home in the body, we are away from the Lord. For we live by faith, not by sight. We are confident, I say, and would prefer to be away from the body and at home with the Lord. So we make it our goal to please him, whether we are at home in the body or away from it. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each of us may receive what is due us for the things done while in the body, whether good or bad.
Oh, that's amazing.
Amen.